Okay, let's get started. Welcome everyone to our Cannabis and the ESG webinar. My name is Goshka Folda. I am President CEO of Investor Economics, which is a Canadian research arm of ISS Market Intelligence and part of the broader ISS family of companies. I also serve as the global head of research at ISS Market Intelligence. I'm very excited to have everyone join us today for a discussion of about a topic that is interesting, I would say possibly controversial, and to help us debate that, we've assembled a very esteemed panel that is dialing in from around the world, from Stockholm through New York, through Long Island, I believe, all the way to San Diego, our marketing team supporting us from there. So we're covering a lot of time zones and jurisdictions. Before I introduce everyone on the panel, let me just go over a few housekeeping rules. The roundtable discussion is being recorded, and it will be distributed to attendees and others who are interested in this content after the webinar. If you do have questions for the panelists, please take the opportunity to file them in the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom panel. I will pose those questions probably towards the end of the discussion, and those questions that we do not get a chance to respond to during the session, we will actually respond directly to you. So I think that's about it for the formalities, and now let me do the pleasant thing, which is to welcome our great panelists. Let me start with Martin Glass, who is co-chair of General and Block's cross-border transactions practice. And I just found out that he is a fellow Canadian, or at one time was a fellow Canadian out of Montreal. Martin has extensive experience in complex M&A and securities transactions involving cannabis companies, and regularly counsels clients on continuous reporting and governance, corporate governance requirements to companies in this segment. Welcome, Martin.
Thank you.
We also have a great pleasure to have Daisy Mallet. We just met a few weeks ago, but I already feel like we're connected on a couple of topics that are near and dear to our hearts. One of them being, of course, the female representation and the asset management, capital markets, wealth management business. So Daisy will tell us a little bit more about that later on. Daisy Mallet joined us as president partner at Merida Capital. This role, Daisy oversees the day-to-day flow of communication with Merida's portfolio companies, investors, and consultants. Just for those of you who are not familiar with Merida, the tagline that I saw on your website is responsible investing across the cannabis ecosystem. So really a perfect melting pot of ideas for this particular webinar. Welcome, Daisy. Justin Ort is CEO and portfolio manager from Measure 8 Venture Partners. He is actually in the office today in New York and Midtown, so very excited about that. Hopefully this is the portent of things to come, where we all can go back to our offices rather than hosting everyone in my living room here in Toronto. But of course, I'm delighted to do that anytime. What I saw that really intrigued me on Measure 8's website was that it's a full spectrum approach to cannabis investing. So clearly, we look forward to your kind of a particular perspective on the cannabis investing. Justin, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
And finally, I welcome Jay Simpson, who is our homegrown expert on cannabis. And Jay is Associate Vice President of Sector-Based Screening for ISS ESG. He works with my great friend Bonnie Sainet, who's the Global Head of Research at ESG. And Jay is joining us from Stockholm. So it's good afternoon to you, Jay.
Good afternoon, good morning.
Thank you. So rather than me pontificating about a topic that I probably am not absolutely qualified to do, I thought I will now lean on Jay to give us an introduction to the interesting intersection between cannabis and ESG, and how we can really think through these topics together. Jay, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Goshka. Well, firstly, I'd like to say, I mean, it's still amazing for me to be involved in conversations like this. As a bit more than 3.5 years ago, this was not a conversation we were really having at all. So in my capacity doing research for ISS ESG into corporate involvement in controversial activities such as alcohol, tobacco, fossil fuel, cannabis was really not part of the equation. Then in the lead up to the full legalization in Canada in 2018, we started to really receive a big influx of investor questions, wanting to know, what's going on, what's happening, what is this change about? So we started a cannabis screen, and I thought as a way of setting the stage, I'd share a few of the key observations we've made over the past few years and some of the main questions we've dealt with from clients, from investors. So as a first point, identifying the drive behind this shift in political, legal, and public attitudes has been really important to understand investor implications. And here I think the key theme emerging for policymakers has been the protection of public health and welfare. And I think this is twofold, really, both in terms of maximizing the medical potential and also minimizing the harm caused by the illicit trade in cannabis through regulation rather than enforcement. And I think this is an approach for policymakers that is, paralleled in some way in the choices that investors have to make, how to, maximize the benefits and minimize the harm. But I would also say it's important to note that a lot of the changes have been driven by public opinion. I mean, a lot of legal reforms in cannabis have been driven by voter initiatives. And in general public opinion, I think, those themes are the same. The big needle movers are, I would say, significant developments in medical cannabis, particularly well publicized innovations such as treatments for childhood epilepsy. And also, on the other hand, a sense of frustration with the failure of the war on drugs and the burden to society surrounding the criminality of cannabis. But when we start to look at what informs these approaches, it really becomes clear that there's no one size fits all approach, and there are a range of diverse and divergent questions and concerns that do exist. And I think these are reflected in the most common questions we receive from clients, such as, how do I know we're not investing in a company that is in violation of US federal law? This is a compliance issue, and I think it highlights the lingering legal uncertainty surrounding the persistence of federal illegality in the US. Another question we often get is, how do we know the medical application is genuine? What are the products this company is producing? And I think that highlights, the gray area that exists between the medical and the recreational. What is the legitimacy? Is there a genuine pharmaceutical application of the product, or is it, a backdoor to recreational use? And also, I'd say finally, one of the questions we get a lot is, how do we know the company has no exposure to cannabis? And this really reflects the growth and spread of the industry, and particularly the increasing interest taken by large firms from other more established industries such as big tobacco, alcohol, and pharma. And finally, I think, as an observation that is becoming more apparent and particularly relevant for this discussion, is the ESG spotlight. I mean, this is interesting because it's a new industry in a new era where I would suggest that demands for accountability and transparency with the broader suite of environmental, social governance concerns and sustainability in general have never been more apparent. So it'll be interesting to see how this burgeoning industry meets those challenges, especially when it comes to issues like diversity, inclusivity, and climate change, amongst others. And I think in addressing, some of these concerns, risks, and opportunities, I very briefly outlined, because we've got a packed agenda, so I didn't want to soak up too much time. We have access to some pretty unique perspectives today, so I'm pretty excited. And at this point, before we dive into the panel discussion, we're going to take a moment for a quick attendee poll. You'll have about 30 seconds to answer, and the results are going to be displayed live. How long has that been?
About 15 seconds, maybe.
There we go. Interesting.
So there are about 72% that are claiming they have not invested in cannabis at this time, but I can see that there is a fairly big audience. So it may well be that the interest is really rising in this as we can glean. And thank you very much, Jay, for introducing the topic. And a lot of the things that you talked about, we're going to really try to drill into, I think, very, very important points. But from what you can probably glean from Jay's introduction is that this kind of answer to the key question, to invest or not to invest, is a really nuanced one. And I think that to my again, non-expert mind, it brings also to the fore the difficulty which many responsible investors face when they're trying to reconcile their dedication to each of the letters in the ESG acronym. Environmental, social, and governance topics or ideas are often aligned, but very often are in opposition. So we're going to try to peel kind of the onion on this topic. But I think that it's to start us on the discussion to invest or not to invest. We can see just how various organizations or institutional investors around the world are already making decisions. In Canada, BMO launched Bank of Montreal for our American attendees launched ESG ETFs in 2020, and it did include 3 cannabis stocks in ESG Leaders Fund. Meanwhile, RBC, Royal Bank of Canada, has decided to perform negative screen against cannabis producers in its asset management unit. So this really is a kind of a crystallization of how complex this topic is. So Jay, maybe we'll start with you. What do you think, why do you think there are such contrasting interpretations of whether to go into cannabis or not go by very large institutional asset owners out there?
Yeah, I would say, it has a lot to do with the identity of the industry itself. Again, this split between the medical and the recreational. While certain investors are happy to embrace medical opportunity, they're concerned about commercial opportunism. So I think that's where you get a lot of the contrasting characterizations of the industry. At the same time, there are, certainly going to be investors who are going to take a zero tolerance approach that want nothing to do with it. But then there will be others who see the ESG benefits as outweighing the risks, or there will be those who take a mixed approach. And I think, it's because there is such a divergent kind of character to the industry that you see these different approaches.
That makes sense. Martin, from your perspective, can you tell us maybe a little bit more about General Block's involvement with companies in the cannabis sector, and about your perspective on what are some of the most pressing concerns as you hear from investors and also from companies themselves who engage with investors?
Thanks, Goshka. And just to set the table, just to tell you a little bit about what we do in the cannabis space. We represent a lot of operating companies in the space and also private equity funds. So among the operating companies we represent, and I try to do this in alphabetical order because I try not to favor any of my children, or our children, I should say. Aurora Cannabis, Cresco, Curaleaf, Green Thumb are some of the companies we regularly represent. And then, like I said, we do a lot of work with private equity funds also in the space. I would say big picture, what differentiates this space from a legal perspective, among other things, is of course the federal illegality in the United States, which makes it difficult to clear and settle securities. And there are definitely asset managers who are comfortable delving into the sort of gray area, and those who are not, something obviously we fully respect. And so we spend a lot of time on that. I will also tell you that those are my clients who do in fact have to deal with the federal state illegality, as opposed to those who don't, definitely run into more complications. It's harder to clear trades, it's harder to move money, and so on. So it's really on both sides of the equation, as you would expect, both asset managers and opcos.
Very interesting. Now let's move to our investors in the segment. Daisy, let's start with you. Can you, by way of introduction into Merida Capital, can you tell us a little bit what attracted Merida to the sector and how you're involved, and then you know, how do you perceive the kind of the risks and benefits of investing in cannabis sector?
Well, thanks, Goshka. It's interesting that you ask if, how we were attracted to the space. In fact, we were sort of founded uniquely to invest in the space. Cannabis was there before Merida. We go way back. Mitch Brugwitz, who's our managing partner, is one of the earliest de novo licensing winners. And his story was founded on, a very personal situation whereby a very good friend of his was hit and paralyzed, and didn't, because he was East Coast based, he had no access whatsoever to any cannabinoid based medicines. And the opioids that were prescribed to him were sort of, exacerbating the situation. So he moved out to Colorado and he treated himself with cannabinoids. And Mitch, saw that from a very personal level, how efficacious that was, and realized what kind of an opportunity it was to bring a more effective pain management to, a larger scale. And then, very much, as Mitch would do, he delved very deeply in and, began to explore what it is to win a de novo license in very competitive states. And as he was doing that and writing these applications, realized what kind of opportunity it is, what cannabis is, and not just in terms of cultivation and the plant itself, but all of the ancillary industries that surround cannabis. And that's, all the verticals, medical, packaging, data. And so, he founded Merida about 5 years ago. And the fact that, we've grown to where we are today is really a testament to how massive the industry is, as Jay said, it's just burgeoning. And we started, when I joined in 2017, we were 5 people. We were celebrating a $10 million commitment. And 2 funds later, we just, surpassed 100 million in committed capital. We've got 50 deployments, 25 employees, presence in 6 different states in terms of operations and verticals. And, we continue to grow because it's just such a tremendous opportunity. Now, of course, yes, there are risks, there are operational risks that we've had to navigate. And that's been a very interesting part of my experience. We've found ways to do with it. It's a very state by state nuanced experience, but there's a tremendous amount of benefit to cannabis. I mean, we're so lucky, first of all, to be able to invest in this space that's, got this crazy growth rate. I don't think there's any other growth rate anywhere else out there. But it's really knowing how to navigate mostly the state by state, legality, of course. But, we really have a good grasp on that because we've been doing that for so many years. When you go into a de novo license, you really have to understand the landscape that you're dealing with. So we've gotten a lot of information, from our on the ground efforts in doing that. But, in terms of our investment thesis, we have to approach it from a very macro perspective, and we don't delve into a company directly. We tend to delve more into, companies that really provide two things or service two things, and that's to sort of remove friction where friction exists at the moment. So, we're deep into a compliance platform, for example, that allows all kinds of operators to do what they need to do while meeting the very robust regulatory requirements of each state they're in. And then we look to companies that have like no natural friction to their growth. So we start there, and we employ a very macro lens, total addressable markets. We try to look for spaces more than companies, because it's such an opportunity for growth that, the company itself may not be perfect, but if it's in the right space, we can move it and shape it and sort of, through our governance and our funding, get it to where it's going to be. And then what we do to further reduce risk would be, we have a very robust portfolio company, suite, as I mentioned. We try to do what we can to plug each new investment into an existing portfolio company. And by doing that, we reduce risk, and we create this synthesis in this ecosystem and allow for sort of growth to happen in tandem. So that's a lot of information. I'll leave it there for now. I can delve in deeper, a bit later, but that's kind of how our overall approach to this, this massive industry.
Thank you, Daisy. So it's interesting that by virtue of the fact that you have been around for, in this business, I guess, for a fairly long time, and the number of deployments and the capital, you're able to diversify quite well. So that's another takeaway from me.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Justin, same question to you about Measure 8. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more how you guys are involved and what process you follow to identify opportunities.
Yeah, thank you. Sure. So Measure 8 was originally founded by my partner, Boris Jordan. Boris is well known in cannabis. He's the executive chairman and largest shareholder of Curaleaf, which is the biggest US MSO. He's probably the most successful investor in cannabis heretofore, and he's deployed hundreds of millions of his own money into the space, Curaleaf most notably. But he saw an opportunity to do minority investments as well. Not everything fits the Curaleaf platform, and he's like, as Daisy alluded to, there's so many things about cannabis that are attractive. So he saw tons of opportunities beyond the Curaleaf, that weren't exactly a fit for Curaleaf. And so we started Measure 8 we launched our original VC fund in 2018. I joined in 2019. I've been a cannabis investor and just a broad investor for 25 years, a cannabis investor since 2014. I've done 11 or 12 private investments before I joined Measure 8. And so I really just thought it was an amazing area to be in. I've seen every trend over the years, every fad, and nothing really called me to leave just trading generally and focus just on cannabis until cannabis. So Boris asked me to join as CEO in the beginning of 19. I launched a hedge fund in August of that year. So we have a hedge fund strategy that runs 60 million. We're up to 330 million deployed on the VC side now. So we have a little bit of a different tact on the VC side than Merida. I don't want to, speak for Merida, but I think we do a more concentrated approach. We only have 9 investments that constitute those 330 million to give you a sense of scale. We try to write bigger tickets, have very deep involvement in the companies. I agree with Daisy that there's a lot of tailwinds, and but we do try to find the best player within the sector as opposed to just being more macro. Not that I think they both can work. I think there's a ton of tailwinds in the space. On the hedge fund side, we use a combination of short-term trading strategies. This is a very unique space, very idiosyncratic. It's hard to prime brokerage. It's hard to get borrows. So if you're a professional investor and you focus purely on cannabis, we feel like you have a sustainable edge that you don't get in other sectors in the marketplace. And we just try to be we try to know the best companies in the space. We know them from the private stage. We know them as they come public. Finally, the capital markets have opened up in 21 a little bit. So we've seen some really exciting new entrants into the market. And so that's our thesis, is that the sector is best played with a public market vehicle and a private market vehicle. Over time, we've seen periods where the valuations have really converged and diverged. At times, the public markets were actually cheaper than the private markets, and now they've diverged quite a bit again. So it's just interesting to have both vehicles, we think, and happy to take any questions and get into everything else.
Thank you, Justin. So in any event, it seems to me like this is surely, you know, everybody wants to jump on the bandwagon when the industry is taking off, but it seems like a very particular field that requires quite a lot of expertise, and I think that that's why we're having you guys on the panel. So I want to dive a little bit more into the legal risks with Martin. Now, I know, of course, Canada became the second country in 2018. It was after Uruguay, actually, to legalize recreational marijuana. But the sector has attractive, some positive, but also a lot of very negative coverage. I know that Aurora Cannabis that you guys represent has faced several class actions accusing executives of withholding some critical information about weak demand and oversupply. It seems also that more recently, some governance issues purportedly have cropped up related to maybe the again not proved, but a misuse of the federal assistance program during the pandemic in Canada. So, drawing from your experience of working with Canadian-based cannabis companies, Martin, how successful have you and these companies been in addressing these and navigating these legal risks?
Thanks, Gosha. Thanks for the question. I would say really that what's happening to Aurora Cannabis or a lot of their peers in the Canadian market is no different than what would happen in any other emerging industry when stock prices are volatile. I may be a lawyer, but I don't have the most respect for my brethren who sort of are, in my view, ambulance chasers, you'll forgive me, and just try to, you know, make trouble whenever they can make a quick buck. I mean, that's kind of my view of the world. I mean, it could be wrong, but that is my view of the world and how I perceive this. So I don't think there's anything germane to what Aurora Cannabis did or didn't do. You know, it's a classic stock drop case, and we view it as frivolous as 95% of these cases, frankly. So you can take it from where it's coming from. But, you know, I think this is just to be expected. Emerging industry, volatile stock, lawyers will try to sue, rightly or wrongly, in our view, wrongly, obviously.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think that there has been probably as much misinformation and because that, you know, cannabis, especially in Canada, has been a kind of a hot topic. So it does make front pages, and I'm sure that that's also attracting this kind of a, you know,
No doubt. I mean, I will say it was quite heartening to me. I was literally sitting at a diner in Toronto and I saw the ticker symbols on BNN, which is the Canadian equivalent of CNBC. And because I guess of their name, like the first thing you see is Aurora Cannabis, it just comes along. And it made me feel like I'd sort of arrived, you know, in a strange little way. So yeah, it's very high profile, no pun intended. So all of these companies, not just Aurora, right? Canopy, all the others, have attracted quite a high level of, you know, scrutiny and shareholder litigation. We'll see where it goes. I'm deeply skeptical. I really am.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not that surprised that this should be happening. Now let's pivot away from the risks into the topic of benefits. Maybe Jay, can you quickly maybe summarize some of the benefits of cannabis investing that you perceive for responsible investors?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the benefits are overwhelmingly on the medical side. I made mention of Epidiolex in the intro, and I think that's quite a groundbreaking case. You know, cannabis-derived medicine specifically for the treatment of childhood epilepsy. I mean, you know, who's not going to get on board that? And I think along those lines, you know, with legal barriers being removed to increasingly open the doors for R&D, you know, there's potentially life-changing medical innovation to be found in cannabis. I mean, Daisy mentioned opioids before, and I think you know, the space for cannabinoid treatment to replace opioids and also to treat opioid addiction is pretty compelling, and there's a long list along those lines, and also things that, you know, are in the pipeline. I was reading just recently about a lesser known cannabinoid, cannabigerol, CBG, showing very strong signs of effectively treating extremely antibiotic resistant staph infection. So, I mean, there's a long list along those lines, but I would also say as a caveat, the benefits are only as good as the medical regime deploying them. So it's also interesting that Uruguay was mentioned. I think as the first country to go fully legal, they've also really struggled with gaining any tangible benefits from legalization. So they are to be found, but I think the proper regime and controls have to be deployed as well.
Yeah, that makes sense, Jay. But it's interesting that medical component or benefit is going to probably become, that's another tailwind, especially given the huge headwinds that opioids are attracting right now in terms of, when you see McKinsey having to pay a lot of money for consulting to the companies, that kind of raises even more risks. So I think there is a definite opportunity there. But one of the benefits that I would like to explore with Daisy is given the fact that cannabis is a kind of a new and burgeoning industry, you sit at the intersection of that new industry and the capital markets, which are, of course, male dominated. My apologies to all the gentlemen on the call, but it is what it is. We have to call it as we see it. Is there an opportunity? Do you think that there is an opportunity in this industry to advance the female representation? Or is it going to be more of a Wild West and not much to be accomplished there? What are your thoughts, Daisy?
Well, the short answer is that there should be, absolutely. But as such, I mean, at this time, I would say that strides have definitely been made. But the traditional, again, apologies to men, and I have great working relationships with all my colleagues, but the traditional male-dominated characteristic of the larger financial world is really still pervasive in cannabis. From an executive perspective, the percentage of women who are in a C-suite role or who are directors, it is still incredibly low, and there's definitely ongoing inequality to access to capital. I mean, again, a very, very, very low percentage of women are actually considered in terms of venture capital. And, that's true for the larger financial industry. It's very true for cannabis as well. Anecdotally, a partner of mine, when we were talking about this, said that recently a good friend of his who's a female, operator out in California at times has to have him accompany her into a pitch, into a conference room just for the optics of having a male presence. So it's still there. But that said, I have some incredible female peers in the space doing amazing things. The consumer base in terms of, females as, holding the family purse strings provides a humongously compelling opportunity for women to be, chosen to market to women. I think that, Merida has done a really fantastic job of, putting women like myself in positions of leadership, and in terms of how our portfolio companies represented. A lot of women have been considered, a lot of women have been chosen, not specifically because they're women, but because they run and operate great companies. So long story short, we have a long way to go, but we've definitely come, we've come sort of, strides so far, and, we're just getting started.
Yeah, thank you, Daisy. And it is interesting that the profile of the cannabis consumer, if you will, has been changing and shifting towards a more equal consumption by females and males. And then does that represent an opportunity, perhaps another opportunity for more females to, market to female consumers?
Oh, absolutely. Women are increasingly kind of curious, and as in terms of, the legality, which prompts more people to be curious or more people to delve in, women are becoming much more open to the substitution of alcohol for, a THC or a CBD. So as a consumer, absolutely, we need women owned and operated, or at least marketed companies to, really drive the focus there. In terms of how we market, we don't necessarily look to, like, for example, with CBG, the beverage that's going to be marketed to women. we take much more a broader approach to, you know, the cannabinoids that are going to be infused in each beverage and that need to be replicated. So we look to companies that are going to be providing that to like this branded space. But, you know, absolutely, we understand the need for women to represent and to focus on women. And we have, you know, embedded that into our portfolio. We have about 25% of our companies are female owned and operated or founded.
Well, I think that's really interesting and great segue. Thank you, Daisy, to the topic of just general topic of another potential benefit. Again, a growing industry and how it can advance the diversity and inclusion. You know, I think that in many ways, this kind of a clean slate startup of an industry is possibly an opportunity to inject diversity inclusion into the very DNA or the ethos of the business as it's just starting to stand up. So Martin, let's start with you. I think this is a really important topic. Again, somewhat near and dear to our heart. We did a webinar with ISS ESG in December on this very topic and had a great discussion. So Martin, you've been exposed to many mergers and acquisitions in this space. Have you noticed any distinctions between the types of people who make the executive teams in this business versus in other sectors?
Candidly, the answer to your question is not really, for better or worse. Probably mainly for worse from a diversity perspective. I mean, a lot of them, you know, kind of look and talk like me, right? I mean, there is this perception out there that it's a bunch of potheads, Cheech and Chong, you know, doing these deals. In reality, I mean, the reality from my perspective is the exact opposite. I mean, they could be running a widget company for the most part. I mean, you do meet some interesting characters, but that's true with every, I think, entrepreneurial endeavor in my experience. You know, I used to do a lot of mining deals and still do, and that's a whole other kettle of fish. You know, those are not necessarily the people you'd expect to see at your local bank branch either. So I would say that big picture, not very different from what you'd expect in most other emerging industries. I do think that certain companies have done a tremendously good job of addressing this issue. And I think one in particular, frankly, does deserve a call out. And that would be Green Thumb Industries. If you look at their board, it's really quite diverse, I think, at least in relative terms. There are others. You know, I think Cresco's done a pretty good job too. And I'm sure there are others. But I must say, at the risk of repeating myself, I think Green Thumb is really pretty all in on this, to their credit.
Thank you, Martin. Justin, what's your perspective about this topic?
Well, I just want to circle back a little bit to some of the benefits that I see from cannabis, because I do think it's an important, you know, important issue. Overall, I really do think the benefits strongly outweigh, you know, some of the perceived risks and the stigmas. You know, this is a new industry. You said it so perfectly. We have the chance to sort of set our stamp on it, be diverse and inclusive from the beginning. And I think that to a large degree, the industry is better than other industries at doing that. If you walk into a dispensary or a cultivation facility, or, you know, into the office, the executive office of a cannabis company, it's more colorful, it's more diverse. You know, I think that's really apparent. That it's not where it should be yet. Don't get me wrong, and you can always work to get it better. But I think that's one of the most exciting benefits, is that you really can put a stamp on it from an early stage. None of the leading brands. There's no Coke in the market yet. There's no Pepsi. Like, we're really at a very early stage. I think that for social justice, you know, the ability to give direct reparations to these communities that have been harmed, that's something that no other industry really has that ability to do. And I think with regard to the opioid crisis, someone mentioned it earlier, I think there's, you know, as an exit drug versus an entry drug, everyone used to consider it an entry drug, but it really has shown to be an exit drug. And, you know, well-being, displacing big pharma. Those are some of the benefits that I think, you know, people, instead of prescriptions, are going to go for, you know, a formula of cannabinoids that are much more beneficial for your body, much less harmful in the long term. So those are some of the things that I look to benefit from. And then as an investor, some of the risks that are perceived are actually the benefits as well, is that the federal illegality and the different structures, that's what gives you fair valuations. That's what gives you access to things at an early stage. And that's what's really attractive from an investor standpoint. And that's, I forgot what the original question was at this point, I'm sorry, but
No, we were talking, I think that you answered it about diversity and inclusion, but I think that you raised, this topic that you raised about social justice and going back to communities that have been, in many cases, kind of forgotten and left behind. I think that's a really important thought.
I mean, the tax revenues that have been generated from cannabis in Colorado, for instance, have been massively impactful. And these states are starving for it. In every case, a good percentage of the tax revenues are allocated to the communities that really were unfairly punished from the war on drugs over all these years. That makes you feel good as someone in the industry, you're making a bit of an impact back to them. So that's a huge piece of it.
Yeah, that makes sense. Daisy, and just to wrap up that topic, I know that you've spoken, that you've told me about kind of the issue of BIPOC. You mentioned that 25% of companies that you work with or that you invest in are led by and owned by female executives. What's your? I know you also talked about other initiatives that you have done on this topic. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Sure. Well, to go back, it is, cannabis is incredibly unique right now. I think it's a once in a lifetime opportunity in terms of investment, just because of the regulatory arbitrage that really, I don't think any of us have seen in our lifetimes. And in terms of, what states are doing with their tax revenues is truly fantastic. And I think that, I as a resident of New York, really hope that this recent legislation would do well to, follow the example of Colorado. I've been lucky enough to be a participant in a fair number of applications at this point. And it's really important to note that these applications really do call for a comprehensive response to the harm caused by the war on drugs. I mean, you have to be very thoughtful in writing these applications about how your dispensary or cultivation is going to, beneficially impact the local community. You have to be careful about your org chart and very thoughtful about, who's going to be represented. And, so each state has its own set of criteria, but I think in general, there's a lot of thought being put into how we're going to, benefit minorities. So with that said, I think that it really is up to the private sector to take it upon itself as people who are creating wealth, from this, erstwhile illegal and, problem from a criminal justice perspective to right the wrongs as best we can. And we 2 years ago, 2019 actually already, we did just that by starting this a program called the I2. So it's an inclusive industry accelerator. So we basically took applications from minorities and women-owned companies that would otherwise have zero access to capital. And we chose 5 of them, invested in them, and have since been fostering them. We've been, helping them with governance. It's been a mentorship. We've, additional capital that's been allocated and giving them just the opportunity that I don't think they would have had available to them. And we've had some great success. I mean, recently one of our companies, High Road, has gone from this incubation, place to, Series A funded company that's now employing other minorities in the states in which it operates. So I think we are a fantastic example of, the private sector taking it upon itself to, to do what we can in tandem with what states are doing.
That's fantastic. I think there's probably lots more to come on this topic, hopefully, and more progress that can be made. And moving to the kind of the last planned pod before we move to any questions, is the importance of decriminalization. Of course, in Canada, for those of you dialing in from not from Canada, Justin Trudeau, who is our hip prime minister, articulated the rationale behind Canada's decision to legalize recreational marijuana in the following fashion. The promise we made around legalizing marijuana was done for 2 reasons. 1, to better protect our kids from the easy access they have right now to marijuana. 2, to remove the criminal elements that were profiting from marijuana. Now, of course, that is Canada. The US is a much more complex story. Martin, can you, in a understandably telegraphic fashion, tell us a little bit about the fragmented approach? It's been highlighted already throughout the discussion, that we see on a state-by-state basis in the US?
Sure. So again, at a high level, no pun intended, what's happening is it is still illegal, full stop, period, at the federal level. Of course, it's a bit more nuanced because it's not enforced if you are in compliance with state law. But at the federal level, it's still a Schedule I drug. At the state level, it varies state by state, but at this point, a majority of states have at least some medical marijuana programs that make it legal in the state. And I think it's now 15 states either are rec or about to go rec. Which is pretty massive. And if you look at who those 15 states are by population, it's really quite tremendous. That's another footnote that's worth mentioning. So that leads to challenges. I mean, it's clearly a regulatory kind of gray area. It leads to challenges in terms of getting comfortable investing. I think every day people get more and more comfortable, literally, but there is no doubt that technically and practically there is still that dichotomy between the federal and state regimes. In terms of day-to-day operations, it makes vertical integration difficult, right? Because it's basically illegal, from what I understand, to really transport marijuana over state lines. And, you know, the whole model of industry in the United States is to make everything in, you know, some state in the middle of the country and then ship it out, right? So that's out the window for now. Putting aside the sort of, you know, how you grow marijuana and how to do it to scale, which I understand is actually a bit more difficult than growing tomatoes. But those are the challenges we see from a legal perspective in terms of day-to-day stuff. And of course, as I mentioned, you know, the access to capital, the how do you clear a trade? How do you get money into a bank account? We can navigate all these issues, but we do have to think about them. And it's certainly not as seamless as doing it for a widget company.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Martin. Now, Justin, I think that you mentioned the kind of the opportunities also related to the regulatory arbitrage that could be had. Do you perceive that as a potential benefit of investing in the sector?
Absolutely. It's like a fundamental piece of the pie. We don't ever make investments assuming a certain piece of legislation is going to occur, you know, that to have the investment succeed. But I think it's pretty obvious that we're making a lot of progress. I mean, we've seen all the states that have moved this year. Schumer's very aggressively talking about federal legality. We'll see how far it gets. Mm-hmm. But you know, I do think there's a huge arbitrage. I mean, I could just see where similar growth stocks trade in that list on the NASDAQ or the NYSE that are even in cannabis that I think don't have as attractive growth prospects as some of the ones that are listed on the lesser exchanges, the Canadian Stock Exchange. And so it's not like a brain surgery to see that, you know, eventually this stock will probably trade at a similar or better multiple when every investor can access it. So we all have heard about the Robinhood effect, for instance. You can't trade CSE stocks on Robinhood. You really can't even trade them on Ameritrade or Schwab. You can't on Interactive. You know, you have to be a pretty sophisticated investor to do it. The long short hedge funds that run billions are in the space. The sort of more aggressive mutual fund families are in the space. Family offices have been dominating the space forever. And, you know, then you have the VC funds like ourselves. It's a very limited group. So eventually everyone's going to have some cannabis in their portfolio. It's going to be $1 trillion of market cap and everyone's going to be exposed to it. So it's, you know, it just feels like a very obvious arbitrage on that standpoint. And then there's also an element of where on the private side, having a real expertise in understanding what's truly achievable, how you can, like, so you get the set of numbers from these entrepreneurs, and I think that they do genuinely think that they're giving you, you know, full and fair estimates of what they can do. But over time, we've learned, you know, what the real metrics are, what can be accomplished in various states. Boris has operations in 23 states, so we've, you know, we really have a wide viewpoint through the Curaleaf lens. And from our, you know, we've done 27 mergers into Curaleaf. We've done 8 investments at Measure 8. So we have a sense of what can be done on the grow side, what can be done on lighting side. And we can really, you know, the numbers that we get from entrepreneurs, we, you know, cut those drastically back and make an investment on our own internal numbers. So that takes a lot of the, we really are de-risking the investment because we're, you know, investing in vibrant businesses and with realistic numbers. That's our goal, at least. And even then, inevitably, issues occur. No business in cannabis goes unscathed. You know, operating in California, for instance, is treacherous. Every state has their own, you know, issues. There's a handful of states where, you know, you have a artificially high wholesale pricing, but you can, even then you really have to be vertically integrated to realize those high prices. So it's a very difficult model. You have to be very nuanced in your approach. And that's why we like to have less investments rather than more and really stay on top of them.
Thank you, Justin. That makes perfect sense. Daisy, I know you spoke also about that kind of diversity of legality across the US. How do you guys navigate that in your portfolio companies?
Well, in terms of understanding it, when you have a lot of operations, as was just mentioned, you have the ability to get this very granular look at what's going on in each jurisdiction or each state. So we take a lot of the information that we glean, from those operations and use that to sort of determine how we're going to make our next move. It really is on our investment team, and we have a really fantastic team of about 10 dedicated investment professionals at this point who are just making their business to understand this state by state landscape. And again, this real-time perspective on the ground that we get is a unique way of navigating the risks. From a larger sort of operational challenge, as was mentioned as well, it was my life work for the past 3 years to sort of navigate each issue as they arise. It's true, it's very difficult sometimes to trade a stock that you've purchased. Sometimes it's difficult to find a custodian. It's really kind of always having solutions to these challenges as they arise, at least from the back end perspective. But understanding all this, it's really this market dislocation and these risks that make this a very unique opportunity for people or companies that understand how to navigate all of these things. And of course, we're doing all this without that massive institutional competition and influx of cash at this point. We also, just more macro speaking, think that every time a state goes rec or there's a bigger market opportunity from a legal perspective, consumers are turning more and more to this legal market. And it creates an incredible opportunity as we eat into the existing illegal market, this massive illegal market that is slowly being taken over from the legal perspective because people want the quality and the choice and the safety and the repetition and in the product. So that has been sort of a thesis that we've been talking about more from a more granular perspective in the past couple of months, if not year, and what we can glean from how each state as it opens allows for us to see how we can take away from that illicit sale.
Daisy, that's a perfect segue into this kind of as the states move from illegal to legal, so do people and industries. I think CEO of Canopy Growth, Bruce Linton, said in 2018, what we have to work on is how we migrate people from an illegal activity to the legal activity, and how we take a prohibitive ingredient, turn it into something compelling. So I think that's a really kind of powerful thought, and can be easy to get done. Jay, from your extensive understanding of the industry, what sort of approaches have corporates taken to reaching that goal of moving from the criminal into the legal realm?
Well, I might focus here on the recreational side, because I think that's specifically what he was talking about. And there, I might focus on edibles as a category, because I think that's really where a lot of the big opportunities in terms of revenue growth lie. And there, I mean, you have a lot of infused cannabis beverages, hitting the market. You have a lot of big alcohol sniffing around, partnering up or taking stakes in cannabis companies, but also cannabis producers looking to partner with big alcohol to find ways of getting the product out there. So I mean, I guess that making it compelling is an interesting way of putting it, because what we're talking about. And we've talked overwhelmingly about the benefits of cannabis, but there are still risks. It is essentially a substance that can be intoxicating and habit forming. So when you're talking about edibles that have far higher concentrations of THC, making these products compelling could also make them quite worrying on a societal level.
Yeah, that's interesting. Martin, what sort of legal challenges typically arise when companies attempt to migrate people from illegal to legal activity?
Sure. So I think it's a little bit of a build it and they will come approach, and also how wide a net is cast in each jurisdiction. So first of all, is it a medical marijuana program? Is it a recreational marijuana program? Obviously, if it's rec, it's sort of akin to alcohol and quite easy for just about anyone over a certain age to get. If it's medical, the question then becomes how many conditions are prescribed within the statute. If it's very limited to sort of like cancer or epilepsy, then obviously a small group of people can come and get the stuff. If it's a little bit more broad, like pain, nausea, then, you know, or anxiety, then it's probably a little bit more widespread in terms of availability. So I think that is, you know, in practice, the challenge of moving people from the illegal to the legal is just making sure it's truly accessible to those who would otherwise seek it illegally.
Makes sense. Justin, from your perspective, and I think you mentioned kind of also Boris's experience, but what do you think, how does the marijuana industry compare to that of alcohol, tobacco, or other narcotics? Are there some parallel challenges, or are there some unique challenges to the cannabis?
I think there's a lot of unique challenges to cannabis, but there's also some parallels. I mean, they're both highly regulated. You know, I think alcohol and cannabis, you know, they're both social lubricants. I don't think there's much in the actual form factors that are much similar. Tobacco, you know, it's combustible. I think that's similar. But beyond that, I think they're really very different. I think cannabis eventually does segment similarly to alcohol and beer and wine. I think that you're going to have a low end and a high end and a medium end in various categories in different form factors. So I think that aspect's very similar. I think that, you know, different parts of society will gravitate towards combustibles, different ones will gravitate towards a tincture, different ones will gravitate towards an edible. So I think that's very similar as well. Some unique challenges to cannabis are everything. I mean, you can't even get insurance, open a bank account. I mean, it's really very difficult just to do the most basic functions. Can't accept credit cards. So, I mean, 280E is the single biggest issue in the industry by far. So, you know, if you get rid of 280E, these businesses are the most profitable companies that you've ever seen known to man. So it's like really a game changer. And I think that hopefully, eventually they'll wake up and see, you know, a little bit fairer tax structure will actually result in more bottom line taxes to the government. So, I think that those are the challenges, just that, you know, you're right, they're very highly regulated, but cannabis is much more nuanced, much more difficult to operate, much more trench warfare day to day.
Well, I am just checking the Q&A, but this audience is very, very timid. I haven't seen any questions come through the topic. I think that's partially a reflection of the fact that, you know, this is still investing in cannabis is still a highly, highly expert enterprise, and as we've heard from our panel. Maybe what I will do to close out the session is pose the second polling question, oh, sorry, we do have a question that let me do the poll very quickly first. Does the question of US federal legalization affect your perception of cannabis as an investable industry? And we'll leave it open for about 30 seconds. And Angelina, whenever the poll is ready. So there is certainly, it's almost split half and half, but there is definitely, I guess I would think of a preference for federal legalization as an important factor in evaluating this investment opportunity. But that is actually one of the questions that has come through our question Q&A panel, which is if current illegality allows fair valuation and structure, how might this risk change as legalization increases? Justin, maybe I'll ask you and Daisy to answer that question.
I'll take a very quick stab at it and then hand it over to Daisy. I think if I understood the question correctly, what are the risks of a fast federal legality? And I think there are a lot of risks because you've been forced to, each state has been treated as its own country for business purposes. You can't ship across state lines. So there's going to be a lot of legacy assets that are going to just be written off. You know, you're never going to grow in upstate New York. You're never going to grow in, you know, almost anywhere but California and Oregon and Florida, perhaps a few other places. But it's going to be like any other vegetable, you know, any other farm good. So I think that's really the biggest risk to short-term federal legality. But I mean, realistically, I don't think you're going to see federal legality within the next 4 years. Even if they begin the process, it's going to be a multi-year process. That's just my two cents.
Complex. Thank you. Daisy?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's very difficult to say when the federal legality is going to happen. And we certainly don't want to position our portfolio on the expectation that it will anytime soon. You know, very much focused on the opportunities as they open up with each state either going, you know, adopting a medical program or going rec. And, you know, even within each state, every time, you know, the key is turned, it takes a long time before you know, operators can figure out exactly what they're dealing with. I mean, you know, early on in cannabis, you know, a state didn't even really have a dedicated, you know, office in its Capitol building that was kind of monitoring what was going on with cannabis. And now we're seeing that happen more and more. It's much more dedicated, it's much more focused. So we have a better understanding of what the expectation is. But when you have a state suddenly go rec, like California did, it was actually kind of a disaster for a lot of the existing operators, because among other things, they suddenly had to meet all these criteria that they just didn't have the capacity to do. So, I mean, whether or not that would be mirrored from a federal legality, I would assume there would be a lot of growing pains, and navigating those growing pains from an operational perspective is something that we have to make sure that as we're investing in these companies, we'd be able to withstand and be prepared. So learning from what we have as each state has gone rec is something that we're going to have to adopt as, you know, we see the government, you know, turning its key as well.
So that seems to me like the topic of regulatory arbitrage and the complexity of the legal status is still going to be a major driver of investing in this segment, and expertise is important. Hopefully we can help both by hearing from experts like our panelists, Daisy, Justin, Martin, Jay. Thank you very, very much. We are actually 2 minutes over. My apologies for keeping everyone a bit longer. As you can see, it's an incredibly complex and interesting topic. I could go for another half an hour easily, but I have to respect everybody's time. This is all the time we have for today. Please, if you have any questions, please just send them to us. Look out for an email with a link to the recording to this webinar. And once again, thank you to all of our panelists and to our esteemed experts, and to our audience. And enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for having us. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.